Hello, this broadcast or this video is about the relationship between the United States of America and Iran. Now, this relationship, of course, is one of the most important for anyone interested in the strategic scene in the entire Middle East. Why? Because the United States, of course, is the player with the biggest military presence in the Middle East, the player with the biggest political influence on all the countries effectively in the Middle East, the player able to project power, military power, not just having bases, but to project military power effectively across the entire region. And of course, it is the player usually with the biggest ability to set the narrative, whether through its media, through its diplomacy. So it is the political player or actor with the largest influence across the entire Middle East. Iran, on the other side, is arguably the player most successful in the Middle East in the last 10 or 15 years. Why? Because it is the player that has managed in that time frame to achieve one of its strategic interests that it has had for decades, if not hundreds of years, which is to expand the presence and the influence of Iran far beyond its borders, primarily in its west, basically to the Levant, to the Eastern Mediterranean. So the relationship between these two players is of immense importance for any observer of the Middle East in the medium term and in the long term. But in addition to that, the dynamic between America and Iran is also of major importance to anyone interested in the key dossiers in the Middle East right now. How? The dynamic between America and Iran obviously affects the oil industry, arguably the most important industry in the Middle East and one of the most important and strategic globally. The dynamic between the US and Iran affects the security in the Gulf and the subtle confrontation between, on one side, Iran, and on the other, the Arab states on the Gulf, especially Saudi Arabia. The America-Iran dynamic affects the domestic politics of several countries: Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen. Also, the relationship between the US and Iran affects the potentiality of peace or war in the Levant and in the Eastern Mediterranean in general. And of course, the dynamic between America and Iran has a huge influence on the confrontation between Iran and Israel. So not just that relationship has strategic importance, but it is with us in any important issue in the Middle East right now. Some observers now say the relationship between America and Iran is at an important junction, meaning, in their view, it is right now at a point whereby it could evolve into a serious confrontation, or it could arrive at some sort of a grand deal between the two. Now, the idea of a grand deal between the United States and Iran is very old, actually. There have been so many attempts to have that major agreement. In the very early days, actually, of the Islamic Republic in Iran, so 78, 79, 1980, during the Carter administration in the US, there were people in the US who basically said, look, we need to have some sort of an agreement with the new regime in Iran. But then several major problems happened and the potentiality of that agreement evaporated. During the Ronald Reagan administration in the US in the 1980s, there was another attempt for some sort of a subtle understanding between the two. And of course, there were players in the US who actually armed Iran in its war with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. But even that led to nothing. During the administration of Bill Clinton in the US in the 1990s, there were also voices in the Clinton administration which also tried to reach out somehow to Iran, to no avail from both sides. Especially in the moment when Mohammad Khatami was elected president in Iran in the late 90s and then again in the early 2000s, there were people around him who also thought that some sort of a new type of relationship, new sort of agreement with the US is needed. But also it led to nothing. Even during the time of George W. Bush, and of course George W. Bush was the president who included Iran in what he called or termed the axis of evil. Even him, actually, his administration cooperated closely with Iran in both of them attending or confronting a number of Sunni Islamist militant groups in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So even then there was cooperation. But that cooperation, though led to many serious discussions, did not lead to a deal, a big deal. And of course, there was the deal between the West, led by the United States under Barack Obama, and Iran, but only concerning Iran's nuclear program. And that was seen as a first step towards a larger understanding between Iran and the US. But yet again, that also led to nothing. And of course, later, President Donald Trump withdrew the United States completely from that deal. My point from all of that long history is that the idea of some sort of a big understanding between the United States and Iran is nothing new. It has been on the table at least now for 40 years. So, is there now, mid-2020, some sort of a potentiality for another grand potential agreement, deal between the US and Iran? I think no, because in my view, there are very serious barriers to that. The first barrier is more or less mindset. The US, from the mid-1940s, late 1940s and until today, deals with the Middle East from a very imperial outlook. Now, some people might say that's a bad thing. I think it's very normal, actually. The United States is effectively an empire, and the Middle East is a region in which the US has very important interests. And some people say, well, oil's importance in the American calculus has reduced a lot over the last 10, 15 years. Correct. Still, there are other interests for the US in this part of the world. After all, geographically, it is a very important part of the world. It wants to deny the geographic advantages that are here in the Middle East to its rivals, China, Russia. In addition to that, from the American point of view, there are threats that are there or are here in the Middle East that the US want to contain, do not want them to get out of the Middle East. The point is that the US intervenes in the Middle East primarily from an imperial mindset. Iran, on the other side, especially in the last 15 years, as I tried to highlight at the beginning of this video, also has been adopting an expansionist mindset. And in a nutshell, the imperial mindset and the expansionist mindset are always clashing with each other, because Iran does not, like many other countries in the region, does not just remain within its own borders and managing upwards, managing the imperial American presence in the Middle East. No, it wants to expand, to increase its influence in different parts of this part of the world. Hence, the mindset clashes between the two. Another barrier, in my view, for an agreement or a big deal between the two is ideological. In America, in the last at least 15 years, but I would say even longer than that, one of the most important powers that were rising, has been rising, is the far right, or you can say the solid right in the US, in which there is also some religious flavors, political Christianity, if you'd like. And there, from many ideological points of view, the nature of the Islamic Republic regime in Iran today, to them, is a natural opponent, if not enemy. And the same, more or less, in Iran. The Islamic Republic regime in Iran, that has been ruling in Iran since 1979 and until today, not only ideologically is opposed to many of the interests and the expressions of power of the United States, whether here in the Middle East or elsewhere, but also an element of its own legitimacy is to oppose the American imperial presence in the Middle East. And therefore, even from an ideological point of view, some would say from a legitimacy point of view, in Iran, there is very, very big difficulty for both sides to find a common ground for a real big strategic deal between both of them. A third barrier, I think, is history. The US has been operating in Iran for a very long time, at least from the late 1940s, early 1950s. And some of the most important people and circles of power in the Islamic Republic regime in Iran now, they are people, they are men who do remember the 1960s and 1970s in Iran, in which, in their mind, which is correct, the United States was the main backer of the regime of the Shah. The Shah, of course, is the king, the Iranian king that the Islamic revolution in Iran, 1978, 1979, overthrew. But in the minds of those people in Tehran, the Shah was not just a king that their revolution overthrew. The Shah represented a certain power structure in Iran that had certain social domains behind it, certain social layers, the rule of certain Iranian elite upper classes, while most of the people who really led the Islamic Revolution in 78 and later the Islamic Republic from 79 onwards did not belong to that social class. To a very large extent, they actually represented the aspiration of lower social classes, of the poor to a large extent. So in their mindset, the Shah and the power behind the Shah is not just political, it's also social. For them, the backing, the American backing to the Shah and his power structure was not just political, it was social, and to them it is personal. My point is, one of the barriers against a coming together of the United States and Iran in a big deal is also the history of the US in Iran, and particularly how it is interpreted by the leaders of the Islamic Republic in Iran today. Another barrier to that potential deal is respect. Iran is a big country, a very old and rich civilization, and it has always demanded that it is to be treated with respect. And here, Iran doesn't really care much about getting respect from its neighbors. That's because in the Iranian mindset, it is higher, almost superior than its Arab neighbors. At least that's how it is in the psyche. What Iran really has always wanted was respect from the West, primarily Europe and the US. And in Europe, many countries actually accorded Iran the respect it craves. But the US has never really provided that respect, especially since the late 1970s, after the coming to power of the Islamic Republic in Iran. That element, which is very important psychologically for Iran, I think is also a big barrier for a grand deal between the two. And finally, another very important barrier is lobbying. American politics, of course, is open for lobbying, whether that lobbying is Arab lobbying, say from Saudi Arabia, Israeli lobbying, or other countries' lobbying, but basically there are very important lobbies in the US that see a need and a strategic imperative for no big closeness between the US and Iran, for no big deal between the US and Iran. I think that these barriers together make the potentiality of a grand deal between the US and Iran very unlikely, very low potentiality. Now, does that mean that the opposite, a confrontation between the US and Iran, is on the cards? I actually think no, because a direct confrontation between the US and Iran is very costly for both sides. And therefore, any cost-benefit analysis for both sides will actually show very clearly that the benefits are very minimal, the costs are huge. And therefore, a direct confrontation, in my assessment, very unlikely. So is there a chance for an indirect confrontation between the US and Iran? Say, a confrontation between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. I personally think also very unlikely, for the same reason. The benefits are limited, while the costs for both sides, Israel and Hezbollah, is huge. So again, any cost-benefit analysis would most likely result that both of them say no war, no. So in my assessment, the very likely scenario in this point of conjunction right now in the American-Iranian relationship is continuation of the situation as is, which is, from the American side, putting more pressure on Iran, primarily through economic sanctions, financial sanctions, more pressure from the American side, with the calculus, the expectation that that will bring Iran somehow to the table when it is really unable to resist anymore. Not for a grand deal, but for some sort of a minor agreement with a lot of Iranian concessions. From the Iranian point of view, the calculus is we can weather the 6 months or so, or less, until the November 2020 presidential election in the US, and there, hopefully from the Iranian mindset, they will see a new democratic administration, or administration from the Democrats in the US, which in the Iranian calculus would lead to better terms for a minor agreement on some of the dossiers. So again, no grand deal, no direct or indirect confrontation, but likely kicking the can down the road, as they say, continuing with the status quo, with each side seeing certain benefits here and there until a better situation arises in 5, 6, 7 months. But there is an important caveat which I think all observers need to keep in mind in that dynamic between the US and Iran. That caveat is the US and Israel have now repeatedly shown in the last few months that they are going to attack Iranian military assets in Syria, in Iraq. And of course, we have seen the biggest operation earlier in 2020 was the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, certainly the most decorated and famous Iranian general in the last 10-15 years. Even very, very recently, in July 2020, we have seen military strikes or attacks in Iran on very important military complexes in which nobody until now has claimed responsibility, although it is not very difficult to guess who was behind them. The point, or the caveat I want to put forward here, is that both sides, the US and Iran, do not want a confrontation, direct or indirect. And the likelihood of a grand deal is unlikely. And therefore, yes, the likelihood of, or is basically to continue the situation as is, with each of them trying to weather it somehow. But the fact that the US/Israel are attacking Iranian military assets in areas of expansion of Iran and potentially inside Iran itself means that the policy of putting pressure on Iran is not contained only to economics. And the question, the caveat is, what is the level of acceptance from Iran, or that Iran will have, towards that policy? Is there a chance that one of those attacks trigger an Iranian response that alters the calculus? I think that is a point that observers of this important dynamic, US-Iran, need to keep in mind.